this webinar series and ways we might improve upon the experience for all of the participants. So without further ado, I will get started in introducing Mike. Dr. Mike Kuhns is my supervisor. He earned his PhD from Auburn University and his master's degree from the University of Missouri. He's currently serving as a Wildland Resources Department head. He's also acting as a Forestry Extension Specialist for the state of Utah. Mike has published a variety of videos, fact sheets, websites, and journal articles on topics ranging from Firewise landscaping to the creation of an easy-to-use tree dictionary of sorts called Tree Browser. In his free time, Mike's interest in cars and car restoration keeps him very busy, and he is currently restoring a 1964 Chevrolet Impala 4-door hardtop, which is quite lovely. Mike is going to present his thoughts today on fitting large trees into communities. Smaller trees often seem best for the restrictions of modern life due to liability concerns, typical hurry-up mentality, and limitations associated with financial constraints or space restrictions. Larger trees are often best for community values, and we have the tools to fit large, high-quality trees into our communities. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike and get this poll out of the way and mute myself. And if any of you have any questions, please don't hesitate to take them up with me or Bethany.
Great, and I assume you can hear me? Somebody?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. First, I want to go actually to the slide before this one and do a little bit of a poll here. Okay, we have two landscapes here that have been suggested as alternates. The one on the left, bigger trees. The one on the right, much smaller trees, maybe a little more controlled. And I want you to, all of you participants, if possible, to, let's say if you would prefer, don't worry too much about the house and the style of the house, but I want to know which landscape you would prefer to be where you live, let's say. So if you're neutral or nearly neutral, still try to pick one or the other. So look at them now and decide which one you like best. Okay, now what I want you to do is go up to the top of your screen, and there's hopefully a person with a raised hand. And if you prefer the landscape on the left, I want you to click on that icon. And if you prefer the one on the right, don't click on it, on anything. And I don't know what you're seeing. Huh?
I can see 26 people have raised their hand right now.
Okay.
28, so 29. Looks like people are sort of finding the little icon. 30. So.
Okay, so
we have 49 participants.
Okay, so maybe 2/3, something like that, prefer the landscape.
We're up to 32.
Out of 49, yeah.
Correct.
So what is that? That's about 60%, almost 2/3 that prefer the landscape on the left. Megan, you can go ahead and clear those. I think you do that by clicking somewhere up there. But we're going to move on now, and we'll get back to this in a minute. Okay, so this talk is on how to fit large trees into landscapes, and it started with a talk I gave, I think, first at one of the first Trees and Utilities conferences that was held in Nebraska City long ago. I think those conferences now have been moved away from there and maybe even move around the country, I'm not sure. But at one time they were held year after year in Nebraska City, and I gave a talk on just the basics of directional pruning and how to do natural target pruning and use that to to prune trees under overhead utility lines. It was something that most people who came to the meetings knew something about, although because they were the managers of the tree clearance group or what have you for electrical utilities, they may not have known the details, but they thought it was worth me giving a talk on that. And right at the end of that talk, I pointed out that this could be a way to actually give in sometimes to the thought that maybe it's okay in some cases to have large maturing trees under electrical utility lines. And that raised more stir and more questions than the entire rest of my talk. And so the next time I gave a talk at that conference, I spoke about fitting large trees into landscapes, or well, where there's electrical utilities involved. And it finally morphed into this talk, which talks some about utilities, but it's more than just utilities. And one other thing I want to mention on this slide is I say how to fit large trees into landscapes. And by large, I don't necessarily mean huge trees in all situations, but where you have a choice, larger trees rather than smaller trees. Okay, so we better get going. Let's see, I've got to click here. I think we need a renewed emphasis on planting and maintaining larger trees. It turns out larger trees are better trees in many ways, environmentally, emotionally in some ways, health-wise. Big trees have a lot going for them, and I think over the years as we maybe built tighter and tighter neighborhoods with less open space, we started to emphasize more small maturing trees, but I think I didn't go into forestry because of a love for small trees. I like small trees just fine, but big trees are what get the oohs and ahs from me and from a lot of people. And I was driving down the street in Salt Lake City, South Salt Lake City, last year and came upon this tree. And actually there were two, one, well, this one and then one a little bit smaller just off the left side of the screen. But I saw this tree and I saw the trunk in particular. The canopy actually is smaller than the trunk seems like the trunk would support. But I knew it was something special and something big. If you've ever seen any large ancient trees, they often are called in Europe, often they have these big trunks with an inordinately small canopy because they've lost lots of branches being around for so long. And so I saw this tree, knew it was special, did a U-turn. My wife just opened her magazine because she's used to this. And I went up to I looked at the tree first. I knew it was a prunus. I didn't know what. And then I went up, knocked on the door, and they came out and actually told me it was an almond, a sweet almond, which I had heard rumor might be in Salt Lake City, but it turns out this was currently the largest sweet almond growing in Utah, so it's our champion now. And even though large trees, especially if they're quite old, start getting kind of crappy in some ways, still this landscape would be poorer were it not for the presence of this and its sister tree. Here's another outstanding tree. That last one was on private property. One thing, I'm not sure I'll get too much today, but is the thought of where are we going to best be able to grow large old trees. So I'm not talking like a cottonwood that grows fast and gets large fast. I'm talking large, old, high-quality trees. And in general, I think public spaces are going to be our best opportunities to grow such trees. I started realizing when I was thinking about this idea, I looked at commercial landscapes and realized commercial properties turn over so fast that I don't think there's hardly any chance of growing big trees in those places, big old trees. And even some public settings like street trees in particular, which often are on public property, have too much disruption going on. I think institutional settings like this county courthouse in Utah County, Provo, Utah, these may be our best shot at growing these big high-quality trees. This is a tabletop elm, it's called. You notice there's supports actually holding up the branches from drooping down to the ground. It's a really great tree and adds a lot to its setting. Some other big trees in similar institutional settings. Here on the left we've got a couple of pines. They're some really warm weather species. I'm not thinking right now. This is in the St. George, Utah area, so they've got Mondale pine and they've got one other that I just can't think of right now. But these are big trees, and there's plenty of room for them in this case, and it's a great place to have some big old trees. This tree on the right, sorry the camera was crooked when I took the picture, but this is the largest London plane in Utah in Liberty Park, Salt Lake City, about 100 feet tall, and a wonderful tree. It's in a large public space where there's plenty of room for it and where likely it can stay for a long time, and it's already been there for a long time. But here are some smaller trees. So I said larger rather than smaller where you have a choice. It easily could have been argued that this is a place for some maybe crab apples or something. Actually, crab apples are a little too small, but something smaller than what is on either side here. Well, it looks like mostly on the right side we have street trees. We also have them in the middle, and this is in downtown Seattle. It turns out the trees on the right actually are planted in culverts because it's about 15 feet down to the actual soil level from the base of those trees. I think this is where that occurs. And they planted the trees in the middle over an old trolley or streetcar line. The track is still there, and these trees are growing over the top of it. So these aren't huge trees, but they're bigger than often would be recommended in this site, and it really makes for a nice setting over what it would be if there weren't trees or only small trees. Here's a couple of private landscapes, one in Salt Lake City on the left with incense cedars. There's 3 of them. On the right we have a catalpa, and there's actually 2 more catalpas planted at 3 of the 4 corners of this house. That's in Logan, Utah. And the point I'll make here is they're cool trees, but also if you followed modern day recommendations, you wouldn't have these trees where they are, and probably wouldn't be room for them at all in these landscapes. We'll get back to that. By the way, if you have questions we can try for a little bit to have you type them in to the chat line at the bottom, and I'll try to watch for those, and I may answer a couple as we're going along. And if not, I can answer questions at the end, hopefully. This is a large white ash on kind of a semi-public, semi-private property, in that it's a street tree, and in Utah and most cities, at least in the western part of the U.S., cities typically own from the property, the house side, let's say, of the sidewalk all the way to the curb and the street, of course. And they, so it's on public property, but also, like a lot of cities, the city requires that the person owning the property nearby take some care of the tree. And in Utah, you at least have to get people to irrigate them, because they won't survive if you don't. But this is the state champion white ash, Fraxinus americana, and it shows, I think, where there's plenty of room, because this is an older neighborhood, and a wider tree lawn or parking strip was left in or put in when this neighborhood was developed than would typically be left at currently. Although I think some communities are going back to wider parking strips, realizing, I think, that leaving less room, well, making the lots nominally smaller by moving the sidewalk back towards the house or apartment building, you end up with a wider parking strip. The person who owns the land owns less land, but really this parking strip seems like theirs. And I think going with a bigger parking strip and a lower sized, smaller lot can be a good trade-off. I don't know how developers would think about that. Okay. Here's I assume that in this case, the city owns probably beyond the back of the curb, but doesn't own the property that these trees are on. However, the developer must have decided that they were going to put these in. These are pin oaks in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they're on the south sides of these houses. They're really big trees, just in an absolute sense, they're big, and they make this a really nice landscape. It would be very boring if they didn't have these trees, and also they have great shade for the summer. Hang on a second. Okay. Okay. I was just checking the chat pod. Okay. We've got, again, kind of a semi-public, semi-private situation here, where we have mostly residences, some small businesses along this Highway 89, which goes north and south through Utah and through Salt Lake City. This is in Brigham City, and many of the communities along this Highway 89, which in most places is nearly this wide. This actually has 2 parking lanes, 4 travel lanes, and a turn lane, and has a planting of London planes along it that with a nice wide parking strip, and it would just not be nearly as nice without these large trees. We also have, oh, I'm trying to back up. It's not letting me. So let's see. Okay. Let's see if I get to the next the slide I want. Oh, I guess I moved it. So briefly, the rest of what I'll talk about is that smaller trees often seem best for the restrictions of modern life, and why that is. And there's a list of some of the reasons here. But larger trees often are best for what the community wants, and actually best just in an absolute sense, depending on what you're talking about, what values you're talking about. And then finally, talk about tools we have to fit large, high-quality trees into our communities. So first, this point that smaller trees often seem best for the restrictions of modern life, and that's liability concerns because, well, a big tree's got to be more dangerous. Hurry-up mentality, we don't want to wait for a big tree to grow. Cost of maintenance, possibly, certainly, eventually of removal. Lack of space, that's a big one. Lots of the recommendations that many of you are making actually are based on ideas we all have about how much space it takes to grow a tree safely, especially safely, and there are other reasons. So we'll talk about some of these. So community forests, urban forests today, what are they like? Well, if we go based on recommendations that are being made, there would be no large trees where cars might hit them. So often there's a impetus on removing trees from near highways and even streets in neighborhoods. No large trees where they'll interfere with pavement and curbs, with infrastructure. No large trees under overhead utilities. No large trees over underground utilities. No large trees where they'll interfere with signs, like in downtown commercial settings. No large trees where they'll hang over a building. No large trees where they might pose a hazard to people. And really, only small trees is what we have left, if you have trees at all. In many cases, if you follow guidelines, there would be no space for trees. And these are some examples of actual tree placement advice from reputable sources. I imagine some of the outfits you all work for make some of these recommendations. So one recommendation I've seen regarding overhead utility lines is that large trees be at least 45 feet from utility lines. Only small trees or no trees under utility lines. So in general, for a long time, it's been accepted that by many that you shouldn't have large trees under electric lines, but there are some people recommending no trees at all under lines. Large trees at least 24 feet from buildings. And these seem real specific because they are. They're actual recommendations I found in brochures and on the web. Plant large trees at least 40 feet apart. No trees at all if the parking strip or tree lawn is less than 6 feet wide. No tree limbs over buildings. No trees that will hang over your neighbor's property. So where is there room for a large tree? How many of you live in a lot where there would be room for any large tree at all, given all these restrictions? I know I don't. In the utility world mainly, The concept of right tree, right place has been promoted for some time, and this was the first utility I found that didn't have, the trees kind of march down in size from the right to the left, but there isn't one under the pole. And in this case, they say no trees or oleanders within 25 feet of power lines, period. So that would include 10-foot high snowdrift crab apples, for example. Nothing. And I think that's gone too far. And as I said, this would preclude having many really large trees in many landscapes. This giant sequoia on the right wouldn't really fit in any landscape in Corvallis, Oregon that I was familiar with. It's next to houses close by. It's going to be a hassle if it blows over, but it's not terribly likely that that's going to happen, and it's a heck of a nice tree. And then we wouldn't be able to have all these trees around this small house on the left. When you ask people what they want, and this is residents of neighborhoods and communities, these are actual research studies that have been done. Here's how they describe the ideal community forest. They like shady streets lined with large trees with wide canopies meeting over the street. And it's not that everybody thinks this, but the majority of people do, and sometimes a large majority. They like large shade trees, and they like small trees as well, but more as accents than as the backbone of the urban forest. They like views of natural features, and natural includes planted trees in this case. They like to see vegetation. They don't like to see hard structure, infrastructure, like power poles and such. They like utilities to be hidden. That shouldn't be any surprise to utility companies. And they like the idea of trees providing maximum environmental benefits to them and their neighborhood. In particular, people often prefer large trees. In Ohio, a study was done of street aesthetics, and people, I believe, were shown photographs of different street trees settings, and a high aesthetic rating was given to a neighborhood with large trees, shady trees almost hiding the houses, and a low rating was given to small trees, buildings, utility poles, and wires in plain view. In Michigan, a similar study was done where they found that most people preferred large street trees over small street trees. In Chicago, the same thing, and no one even felt that a tree could be too big in that study. And another study showed that tall street trees enclosing space, kind of creating an enclosed space like that overarching canopy, were preferred. So people like this, and this is a great situation. It's a good species. It's not given the city a whole lot of trouble, and other than when they tried to remove, and actually did remove about a block of them a little bit north of this point. This is also a nice setting. These trees are giving this community trouble. This is in Torrey, Utah, down by Capitol Reef and southern Utah. And these are cottonwoods mostly, and they're breaking up, falling apart. And we'll talk near the end about selecting good species. So when I asked you which neighborhood you prefer, and about 60%, a little more, thought that the grown-up large tree neighborhood on the left is what they'd prefer. I think you have to ask yourself, which are we recommending when we put out, create our websites and have, you know, like yesterday I looked on a national nonprofit's website and found that 40 feet between large trees spacing recommendation, and by itself that makes some sense. Large trees certainly should be farther apart in most cases than small trees, but when you take that 40-foot spacing between trees, and then you also say the tree can't hang over or be maybe has to be 25 feet from the house, and then no encroaching on utilities above ground or below ground, you end up with really the landscape on the left wouldn't be possible, and an aspect or two of the landscape on the right wouldn't be possible, but there are no large trees or large maturing trees on the right. So I think we're meaning well in the recommendations we make that are specific to our concerns, but we end up without room for large trees. And large trees give us greater benefits typically than small trees. And I'll go through a few of these. Think of a small tree and what it can do for you in one of these criteria versus a large tree. Almost all aspects of energy savings, for example, are maximized by a large tree over a small tree. Shade, wind reduction, evaporative cooling are all greater when you have a bigger tree. Shade makes pavement last longer, and there, at least asphalt pavement, some of Greg McPherson's research and other people working in California have shown that asphalt lasts longer, both parking lots and streets, and more shade from bigger trees means more of the pavement is shaded. So big trees, again, maximize this. Pollution mitigation, air and water, more gas uptake and particulate uptake will happen from bigger trees than from smaller trees, and they have more extensive root systems that can intercept and take up more water that may have pollutants in it. They also add more organic matter, large trees do, to the soil as their roots grow and die and grow and die, and more organic matter in the soil can help bacteria and other creatures break down pollutants. You have greater stormwater runoff reduction, both because of bigger root systems, but especially because the big trees have big canopies and intercept much more water during a storm, and thereby that water is released more slowly into the drainage system, and you need less drainage system, and you also are able to well, never mind. Big trees generally have a greater visual impact. It's been shown that a big tree near a street can cause greater traffic calming than small trees. Believe it or not, lining, say, a two-lane wide street going through a neighborhood, let's say, lining it with big trees can actually cause people to perceive that they're going faster and therefore go slower than they really mean to, than if you had small trees along that same street. And also, large trees in general increase property values more, and large trees absorb more carbon than small trees. There's a comment by someone saying not every utility recommends no planting of smaller trees under power lines, and their utility recommends small trees like dogwoods, redbuds, etc. And I do think that's true in what I've noticed. I just was trying to show where it's gotten to an extreme. What works against larger trees? And this is where we'll get into the tools we have to promote and retain larger trees. Small planting areas, especially narrow parking strips, often mean small trees are all that will work. Utilities, especially overhead electric utilities, some misconceptions about large trees and what can be done, poor selection, and then legitimate concerns that I think have to be dealt with. So, what can be done for small planting areas? I think that's the most important thing, is having enough room for the root system and also to contain the base of the trunk. And this especially becomes important for parking strips, street trees. But it's a problem in other places as well. And the things we can do is to provide adequate soil volume, require wider parking strips, buffers, and medians, meandering sidewalks to maybe make it possible to save a tree and still retain a sidewalk. Flexible sidewalks are part of that answer. Allow public tree planting on private property maybe so that you can move trees that would be in the public parking strip back on the other side of the sidewalk where there's more room for them. An idea called parking wells plus planting strips, porous pavement and pavers, being careful with tree pits, and structural soils. These are some of the tools we have. The adequate soil volume that it takes to grow a large tree actually I think is pretty well known. And this would be to grow a tree to a large size. So it might be too much soil volume when the tree is young and first planted, but eventually this is what it would take to grow the large tree you'd eventually like a large maturing species to attain. I was pleased to see that when I looked at several different experts' recommendations for growing certain size, fairly large trees, they coincided pretty close in terms of soil volume available, and that was somewhere between 60 and 120 cubic feet, or per inch of trunk diameter. And that would be trunk diameter measured probably at breast height, 4.5 feet. First was Thomas Perry, who I'm certain would have passed away by now. I saw him speak at a conference a long time ago in Omaha, and he has some really great old papers where he excavated root systems, and he found that to grow a 20-inch diameter tree, trunk diameter, you need about a 40 by 40 foot area. The question would be then obviously how deep does that area need to be, but using reasonable assumptions, that came to about 80 to 120 cubic feet of soil that's available for root growth per inch of trunk diameter. Nina Bassick at Cornell University came up with a figure based on research of about 2 cubic feet of soil per square foot of canopy area. So that would be, take the canopy of a tree, project it on the ground, and go 2 feet deep. So you need the area under the canopy 2 feet deep. I assume she would allow for that in some cases. Maybe you're not going to have 2 foot of depth, but it goes wider. But she came up with this figure. James Urban, landscape architect who cares a lot about trees in the Baltimore area, came up with about 1.5 cubic feet of soil per square foot of canopy area, or 60 cubic feet per inch of diameter. And so we're converging here on pretty similar figures for soil volume. In addition, Urban also feels that you can go down to about 4 feet wide for a parking strip to have enough room to contain a tree. And I also did some triangulation on this, and I had some slides of excavated trees where their root system, the soil's been removed, and where you could actually measure the amount of soil volume it would take to contain this root system. So this is an apple tree. It's 15 or 20 years old. It's in England at a research facility, and if we estimate the trunk diameter, it'd be about 6 inch in trunk diameter, and the root system is about 16 feet in diameter and is about 2 feet deep. And when you do the math, that comes to about 400 cubic feet of soil, or of root system, that would have had soil around it, or 67 cubic feet per inch of trunk diameter. Now, if you have less than 60 or so cubic feet, it doesn't mean you couldn't necessarily grow the tree when it's young, but it's going to limit its health when it gets older and will probably limit the ultimate size. So I think 60, again, based on this, 60 cubic feet of soil, rootable soil, is about right. And more is better. Provide or require wider parking strips and buffers, so strips of vegetation, say within parking lots. And I did a Google search on this and found that in Mountain View, California, they require a curbside planting strip 10 feet in width, shall be established to create a boulevard appearance, establish adequate planting area for large-scale species of shade trees, so they got specific, and provide additional buffering for residences. In Logan, Utah, for newer neighborhoods now, at least a few years ago, we were requiring 8-foot parking strip widths, and we at one time in Logan had gotten down to 4 feet or even less. So we're going back up. Unfortunately, we don't have much building left to do in Logan, Utah. However, Syracuse, Utah is out on the edge of the Great Salt Lake, kind of west of Ogden in northern Utah, and they have a lot of building being done and are requiring a 10-foot minimum parking strip width. Eugene, Oregon also encourages meandering sidewalks. And if you want to look more into who's requiring what, do a Google search or another search on minimum parking strip width. So this is a nice wide parking strip, maybe 12 feet. If you're wondering what that thing is paralleling the sidewalk, it's a small irrigation ditch that's been in for a long time and that would flow during the irrigation season constantly. So these trees benefit from that. Here's just stepping out a little and trying to avoid getting hit by a car. Here it shows that parking strip a little better. I also got on Google Earth yesterday and found a landscape I admire. On the left is the Little America Hotel in downtown Salt Lake City. Little America started in western Wyoming, and they're in Cheyenne, Salt Lake City, and they're always known for their trees, even out in western Wyoming, where you see this mirage as you approach it, where there's all these trees where there's no trees around. And the city of Salt Lake City has established that there would be wide parking strips here, but I think the hotel also wanted this kind of a landscape setting, and this is what it looks like from the arrow I had, I think, on the lower right. The hotel's actually behind there, but there's nice wide parking strips, plus, unlike a lot of commercial properties in downtown areas, there's a nice lawn, plenty of room for growing large trees. Meandering sidewalks simply means taking advantage where you can of the opportunity to leave a little more unpaved ground around the bases of trees that maybe are in parking strips that are a little small for them. And here we have a combination of a meandering sidewalk. So the picture on the left is a broken up sidewalk from tree roots breaking it up. It's actually the tree that is near the pickup truck in the right-hand picture. And then they had another tree doing something similar and have put in this case, rubber sidewalk panels, which is a flexible sidewalk material that can be relayed if it heaves and needs to be lifted to maybe have a root or two cut. So it's a combination of using flexible sidewalk panels with moving part of the sidewalk into presumably the yard of the adjoining house. Some cities say they can't accomplish this because they wouldn't be allowed by their legal people to have a sidewalk on private property. And these people accomplished it, but it could be, I have heard that in some cases cities have to get an easement to be able to put the public sidewalk on private property, but they did it in this case. And TerraWalks is one manufacturer both of rubber sidewalk panels but also plastic, which is more being emphasized by them lately. Megan's putting in a link to a pilot project we did using the recycled plastic TerraWalk panels, and so far they're holding up good with the winter, but we just got our first snow a few days ago. But they're looking good so far. The rubber we didn't install. But this shows one of those installations of the plastic panels, and they're looking pretty good. Allow public planting on private property. Okay, so in this case we had a parking strip that was way too narrow for any tree. They were going to consider ripping up all the infrastructure, taking out the trees, putting a sidewalk at the curb, and then putting public trees in the private property on the other side of the sidewalk. And they did this and actually gave a few species choice with people, and then I think the individuals actually planted the trees, and it's now, it retained the treed feeling of the neighborhood, but in a way that works for infrastructure. In Sacramento, they've done tree planting easements, putting public trees on private property, and retaining ownership of the public tree. And I think sometimes you just need to think outside the box. Parking bays plus planting strips is the idea of, on a wider street where you don't want to lose a lot of parking, where you, in what would be the parking lane on the edge of the street, you occasionally bump out the curb at a 45-degree angle to the width of the lane, go along the street parallel for a little while, and then take it back in. It gives you room for parking of a few cars and a place to plant trees. I won't go into this, but I'll show you a diagram. So this is roughly how it would be. Your parking is actually in line with the trees. You've got the full width of a parking lane to grow trees, and that would be these gray areas. The tree will root down the length of that. Whether you like it or not, it's also going to root under the sidewalk and possibly under the street. I think this is a good idea. It's in Eugene, Oregon. And this is near the Little America Hotel in Salt Lake City. It's owned by, I think, the LDS Church, this parking lot, and whoever designed it and is maintaining it and just thought to do it ought to get an award. It's a very attractive parking lot. You see the arrow in the lower right. Never thought I'd say very attractive parking lot. But it's mostly planted in its interior with London planes, which will absorb a lot of the water when it rains so that there's not a lot of runoff, and it's going to be a much more pleasant place to park a car. And there's a couple of parking lots like this in Salt Lake City that they've created that are great. Porous pavement is just a way to make it a little better place for a tree where you've got to have some pavement for walking purposes. I don't mind this. These are loose laid bricks in sand base and sand swept into the cracks. These trees in 5 years, so you can see they've about doubled in diameter. This is in Omaha, Nebraska, and it's a good place to grow trees, and still people can walk along there. Porous concrete and asphalt are possible. This is porous concrete, not really done in an area to help trees, but the oxygen that can get down through here can make it a better place to grow a tree root system. One problem with this is it needs to be cleaned, and that's sweeping and vacuuming several times a year, because if the pores get clogged, it doesn't work. Tree pits like this I don't have much use for. You're ignoring the needs of the tree. There's all sorts of problems with pedestrians and such. They can work. I prefer pits that don't have grates because they're expensive and they often heave. So just various materials can be used where people are going to walk. And these pits are open to soil underneath. In some places like New York, they've actually protected the actual surface of the pit the tree grows out of with various decorative features, which actually seem to work pretty good. And this is a picture from Trees New York, treesny.com, and they call them pit guards.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
We're nearing 1 o'clock, but I just wanted to let you know there are 2 questions here that Jane and Laura have. I don't know if you wanted to address those before you move on, or it's up to you, whatever.
Okay. Many residents do not like the leaves that result from large trees. Any suggestions for urban areas? I got no answer for that. Big trees create a lot of leaves, and I don't think you're going to talk people into liking that. But if people know the benefits of large trees, maybe they'll be more accepting. And then Laura says, in these examples with wider medians in parking lots and the use of parking bays, do you know who is leading the charge for these? Is it city planners, urban foresters, landscape architects, others? I have a feeling it's a combination of all those. And it wouldn't take all of them, but you'd have to have at least a couple of them on your side. This tree is actually growing out of a street. It's a large oak in California. I can't think of the name of this town right now. It's got kind of a Scandinavian feel, but it's doing fine, other than they have to put a barricade near it to keep people, remind them not to drive into it. But normally you'd like a little more formal provision of good soil to grow the tree in. This is in Washington, D.C., a very expensive landscape to grow with very expensive grates that are heaving. I don't like this as much, seeing all this mortar around here, and you couldn't have this in cold country, but this again is in DC. I'd like to see more. I'd much rather see trees clumped up in planting areas that are bigger planting areas, and then have your pavement where you need it on the edges. I think Megan's probably going to tell me to stop pretty quick, but these are actually concrete panels laid on soil material of some kind, so the tree has more room for soil growing in the soil than what is shown there. This is in Denver, and these are not good trees. They're not healthy, and it doesn't seem to me a good place to grow a root system. But it all depends on what they have underneath, or at least partly depends on that. But none of them looked particularly good. This tree growing in this gravel panel can't be doing real well. And this is actually on the USU campus where I work, where a landscape architecture firm put in these trees in compacted road base, which is what you're seeing there, and then put the trees in after using a shovel or a pick to make a hole for the root ball, and then compacted the root balls and then put a little bit of gravel over the top. And it's lucky they used ginkgos, because the ginkgos are still hanging on, and it's been a lot of years. So it's hard for me to say whether this planting's a success or a failure. You can...
Mike, what I might suggest is just skipping to your recommendation slides. It's up to you totally, so whatever you want to do.
Yeah, let me see. Well, so structural soils is just a way to make some oxygen and soil space available under pavement. Yeah, I've got a lot left. I guess I hadn't given this talk in a while, and I also talked for longer than I thought on certain aspects of it. Maybe what we could do, because this utilities stuff is pretty important, we could have me come back another day and give the rest of this. What do you think, Megan?
I mean, it's totally up to you. It seems like we have 62 people still in the meeting room, and they seem like they're probably fine to hang on for another 10 minutes. So
Yeah, so click on
I would
the
do that.
hands up if you, or no, just stay in the room if you want to hear the rest.
Yeah.
And you can ask your questions as well. I won't answer them until after I've presented everything. I apologize for getting behind, but I was pretty relaxed and having fun. So, okay, what can be done with utilities, especially overhead electric? You can do directional pruning in large trees and large maturing trees, and you can also place utilities away from the streetscape, which often is where you have these street trees that are interfering with the electric lines. And directional pruning, I'll assume most of you know, but it ends up leading to some pretty weird looking trees, and people think that, I did a study on this and found that people think the people who do directional pruning under utility lines, they think you don't care about trees and that you're not very knowledgeable, when in fact it's actually helping to save trees. And there is education, a role for education in that, to let people know that you're actually treating the tree well by doing this directional pruning like has been done here in Lincoln, Nebraska with these hackberries. And I'm looking at the power lines here, but if you lived in one of these homes or were driving by, you wouldn't even know there were electric utility up there. This is in a similar neighborhood, wider parking strip, but again, there's utility electric lines down the left side, and I even, when I was taking these pictures, had somebody come out, wonder what I was taking pictures of. These trees have V's to that have been pruned into them to clear the electric lines, and this person lived in one of these houses that didn't happen to have a power pole in front of it, and they hadn't ever noticed that they had an electric utility in front of their house. So you can do it, and Lincoln has gone to the extreme of actually deciding that they want these to maintain these large tree streetscapes, even though they have electric lines in some cases, and they've done some removals for various reasons and replanted new hackberries under the existing lines. So they're accepting it as part of their future. And then they start the directional pruning at a fairly early age. Some has been done here, but more needs to be done. These are those same trees after 12 years. Finally, well, there are misconceptions that people have and professionals have about big trees. And we need to educate the public, and we need to question our own biases, such as that small trees always fit better in small planting strips. Large trees are unacceptably dangerous, and we can and should educate people into preferring small trees. We don't have to do any of those things. Small trees, in fact, aren't usually the answer for small areas, especially parking strips. Small trees never get high enough to be pruned up adequately for trash trucks, plows, or even pedestrians like getting out of a car. So you need a big space even for a small tree. Large trees don't have to be unacceptably dangerous if they're well selected, if a good species is selected and it's cared for. I mean, this silver maple holding up this porch is a big tree that's got problems and is causing problems for that house, but it didn't have to be a silver maple, and it didn't have to be quite so close to the house. Here you've got a overall pretty well maintained landscape. You may wish the big tree was or wasn't there, but it's an acceptable big tree. It is hanging over the house. It's maybe too close to the tree to the left of it, but this is a case where big trees are working and it's fine. With poor selection, we need to promote better big trees. I always express concern when people want large trees that grow fast, which means poor quality, and we should always be concerned about those. But medium growth rate trees often are good quality, and usually you can sell somebody who wants a fast-growing tree on something that's a little less fast-growing but higher quality. So here's an example we plant a lot of in Utah of a large, fast-growing tree. It's a globe Navajo willow, and we should turn these into large oaks and large maples and such. That would be much better in the long run. And then sometimes we need to realize that in some cases people don't want big trees. They don't want the mess, the shade, the visual obstruction. Sometimes they do want them, but not always. So in summary, make room for treetops and roots, especially root systems. Directional pruning is okay under power lines. You don't always have to try to get people to let you remove big, large maturing trees under power lines. We do have options. We need to educate the public and ourselves on what's acceptable and promote better tree selection so we don't have large, crappy trees giving a bad name to all large trees. And then remember sometimes that maybe a small tree, or in some cases even no tree, is acceptable. I think that's it. That's my contact information. If you had questions, you'd be free to email that, or email me at that address, mike.kuhns@usu.edu. And eventually, that's our Forestry Extension website. In a few days, we'll have this recording up. So that's it, Megan.
Great, thanks, Mike. Perfect.
I guess it wasn't too much later.
Nah, that's fine. I think you must have answered all the questions because I'm not seeing any come up. I'm just going to ask folks to hang out for one more second while I try and maneuver our chat pod.